Welcome to the Rehabilitation Collaborative Podcast, where we help our listeners build resiliency despite adversity. I'm your host, Dr. Chris Sovey, owner of Healthy Consumer Physical Therapy in Lansing, Michigan. In this podcast, we connect individuals and communities with resources and exceptional practitioners so they can transform their well-being and become happier, healthier, more mobile, and strong. After listening, if you found the show valuable, be sure to follow our podcast so you never miss another episode again at anchor.fm/rehabcollab. That's anchor.fm/REHABCOLLAB. And with that said, let's get on with the show. Welcome to the Rehabilitation Collaborative Podcast, where we help our listeners and community build resiliency despite adversity. And I want to just introduce myself first. I'm Chris Sovey of Healthy Consumer PT, and I am a physical therapist. And my guest tonight hardly needs an introduction. He's really well known here in the community, is Dr. David Grimshaw. Dr. David Grimshaw owns a private practice in Old Town, Lansing. And how long have you been doing that now?
Here in Old Town since 2015.
Right, yeah. And before that, you were over in Okemos.
Right, yeah.
And there's quite a little bit of a history. What I want to actually frame this around is more around a talk that I heard online that you gave at Leslie Congregation in 2019. I happened to find this, and you had some great points on dealing with family stressors at that time.
Oh, yeah.
So I took some notes on that because I thought now more than ever, especially during the times of the pandemic and what people are going through, that a lot of people are dealing with even more stressors than ever before. But I did want to get just a little bit of background for our listeners about you. And particularly, my first question would be, why did you decide to become a physician?
Oh, well, it was a little bit under duress. I didn't grow up thinking I would ever be a doctor. And I studied environmental studies, and I got really interested in just the integrative way of seeing like ecology and ecosystems. And I studied how chemicals get into the environment. And it was just through an honors project that I picked the subject of how paradigms change in science. And I picked looking at the traditional Western medical model and a more holistic model, integrative model of how medicine could be practiced. And I started getting really interested in the whole idea of like what it would be like to be that person in relationship with the patient and help them get better and encourage them and, just be part of the process of them getting better. And that it won me over. And even though I didn't really I had kind of a negative opinion about medicine. And my family I didn't know doctors, I didn't have friends that were like the kids of doctors and things like that. So I just didn't really have much exposure. So when I first went, I was looking both at MD and DO, and the DO just was like obviously more fitting with what I was looking for, a more holistic philosophy. It has a philosophy, and it really engages the sort of healing powers of the patient. So I went into it with a little bit of trepidation, but once I got to start seeing patients in my third year of medical school, I was good. I was like, I'm glad I did this,
Yeah. You read my mind, because I'm sure that some people, I've had many patients that have come in and asked like, well, what's the difference between a DO and an MD? And there we go.
Yeah, it was interesting in the interview process. You write this, secondary application form, and you put in there why you want to be a doctor. And when I went to the MD schools, which were willing to accept me, but I got really hostile interviews. Huh. Like, what do you have against technology? I felt like they were challenging and I had to kind of defend my philosophy. But in the DO schools that I interviewed, it was accepting. It was like, this is consistent with the DO philosophy. So at that point, I knew, okay, I'm going to be a DO.
Now, did you find over the years that your philosophy and what you just said slowly led you into private practice? Because you had more of a traditional kind of pathway before being in private practice.
Yeah.
And what would you say to that?
I think the circumstances at the university were when I decided to leave and go. I started in private practice as a family doctor. Then I worked for other people while my wife went back to school. And then when I came back, I got a job at the university teaching, and I really loved the teaching part. But the politics and the sort of the environment, the work environment at the university wasn't very healthy. And it was at the point when the dean changed. I had a dean that was really supportive of me. Then he passed away. Unfortunately, he had a sudden heart attack. And the new dean that came in, it was completely, the environment became very, in my opinion, toxic. And so I had been offered the practice by Dr. Briner, her practice, because she wanted to move a couple of years before. And I said, thanks, I'm going to stay at the university. So I called her back up when that happened, the new dean came. And she said, yes, she'd be thrilled if I would take over the practice. So we made arrangements, and I purchased her practice, and she moved. And I'd say once I was in private practice in that setting, it was like I was allowed to be myself. And I gradually grew into my more authentic self and way of being as a doctor.
Yeah.
My kids, I asked them after I'd been in practice a couple of years, I said, so do you think it was a good idea for me to, and their answer was, they said, duh, Dad.
They could see the changes.
They could see I was much happier, and I saw them more. I was part of their lives more. Yeah.
Yeah.
That was very reinforcing.
So your family dynamics changed in a positive way.
Yeah.
Which is the perfect segue into my questions. So the main things that I wanted to ask you tonight, like I said, were based around the speech, an open forum that you gave at Leslie Congregational Church back in 2019. I don't know if you remember that or not.
I do.
And the main topic of your discussion was dealing with family stressors. It was one of those talks that was so good that I started watching it, and then 37 minutes had gone by, and I was like, what just happened? I thought everybody in that audience brought up some excellent questions, and I wanted to expand. And I think that this kind of information needs to get out there, especially now more than ever when people are dealing with a whole slew of different stressors. Especially when, and I'm sure you've seen this too, that more people are isolating, and that's bringing out all kinds of different mental health problems as well that I'm sure you're seeing in your patients as I have as well. And I think that people have a really difficult time, you had even said this yourself, articulating or being a good historian. And as an adult, we're not necessarily any better than a child at doing this. So I'm going to start you off with a two-part question. When someone comes to see you, like in your office, how do you view your role as a physician to help them sort through some of those family stressors, both in the psychological, spiritual, and physical? So let's start with part one.
Okay. Yeah, in my intake form, I do break out stressors, and I'm looking for their perception of which aspects of their life do they find the most stressful. Having to do with money, having to do with family, having to do with work, having to do with their health, are kind of like the main categories. And then I have a pretty long questionnaire. And then but I use it in that first visit. I just literally go through it with them and ask them questions about the answers they've already given. So we just kind of take it. So I get to kind of dial in to and read the nonverbals, the way they're sitting, the way they're acting, how their voice sounds, to delve into it. I feel really careful at first with the patient. I want them to feel like they're in a non-judgmental environment that gives them the space to negotiate the way they want to negotiate, because I'm looking for what they're needing, and I'm trying to help them say it and be able to articulate what they are needing. So I ask those kinds of leading, open questions that are not the kind of question you can say yes or no to, right?
Right.
And then I let them talk. And I really focus on not interrupting. I focus on giving them the space to talk. So that first visit's long. And one of my mentors did that in a chronic pain program, Dr. Stanton. And I watched him do that when I was in my fellowship. And I saw how powerful it was to just wait and let people express themselves. And then I follow them. I don't like dictate how that interview is going to go. I follow them. So that's my method. Is that answering?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And I think you'd also mentioned that talk, like, that sometimes somebody might come in and they think that it's just like a psychological stressor, but you're also a great gateway to help people connect to different resources, and also make sure that there isn't something physical going on, because stressors can cause physical illness as well.
Right. And just giving them a sort of, and they'll usually take the lead. Sometimes that's what they want to talk about first, is the physical stuff. And so I'm not going to press them, and I don't want to ask, questions like abuse, if they've experienced abuse, rather than making them deer in the headlights by point blank asking them. I work around those sorts of things and just try to cultivate the relationship that maybe someday that might be revealed, but it doesn't have to be today.
Right.
So they start to trust me and know that I'm listening and I'm paying attention, but I'm not going to push them into something they're not ready to talk about.
Your whole practice and philosophy is based around creating space. And that's becoming a pretty, in my opinion, rare opportunity in healthcare. It's a rare resource. A lot of your colleagues and my colleagues are forced to do an incredible amount in a short time. And how could you ever uncover some of those things if you don't have that time?
Right. I just think that's essential for healing. And I think it's partly the focus of what do we think we're doing here? The healing is something that happens within a person and within a family, within a community. And it's an organic thing. And I don't heal people. I try to create environments where people can heal. And so that's how I think about it, is we're building a garden here, where the person has the opportunity to find their way, the way they're going to heal. And I don't try to tell them the way I think they should heal. I try to help them find the way for them to heal.
Do you feel that if given space, people are able to come to those conclusions more often than not? Or does it vary a lot? Or, what's your sense of that?
Yeah. I think part of the way I set this practice up is that I'm setting it up in such a way that I'm inviting people. They have to take initiative to come to see me.
Yeah.
They're not it's not court ordered, right? It's not necessarily their family doctor or their internist. But oftentimes, by the time they get to me, several people have said, "Why don't you go see David Grimshaw?" Yeah. And so they're there finally out of their own initiative. And I think that's really key. That without that, you might be just like trying to pull teeth to get people to engage. But I try to welcome the engagement. And so part of it is the way I've created the kind of practice I have. It already invites that kind of engagement. And if people aren't really wanting to be engaged, I don't try to sell them in being engaged. So I give give what I am able to give, and let it be.
Yeah. So if someone feels some type of stressor, how can they become better able to identify what's going on and communicate their needs, both in the scope of the individual and in the family dynamic? And then once they've identified that, what can someone do to better address those needs? Do you feel like a physician is always the place to start with that? I know that you have quite an extensive background in yoga. So, if someone is feeling maybe just like they're not quite sure, they feel like something's off, maybe they feel some irritability, or they just feel a general sense of feeling unwell, how can someone better identify what's going on and learn what the first step to take is?
Okay. I think I'm understanding.
I can rephrase it if
the key, I think, is awareness. And so to be aware of your body, to listen, to learn the tools to listen to your body, to learn the tools to develop a more emotional awareness, intelligence, to understand your feelings, your thoughts, and learn to quiet your mind enough to get ideas come to you, like inspiration and intuition. You have to have a pretty quiet mind for those things to have a place to come. So I think the key is awareness. And so say maybe we're talking about food. So I usually start with what's your relationship to food? How is it that you feel, in relationship to food? And a lot of people have pretty negative relationship to food, but the question is intended to open up awareness. Mm-hmm. And that we start with maybe a food diary, or just start talking about what their patterns of living are, so that I'm always just trying to think, how can I help this person become more aware of how they work, how their body works, how their mind works, how their emotions work, how that influences the dynamics of their life. So if I were to pick one word, it would be awareness. Mm.
That's great, because I do think that a lot of mindfulness is kind of thrown around, and I think there's still a lot of people that don't fully understand what that is. Do you think they're one and the same, mindfulness and awareness?
They're similar. Mm-hmm. I think cultivating awareness is maybe how I would define mindfulness. Mm-hmm. Because it's a practice. It's like I have this card in my office that I like to remind myself with, and it says, no one ever got good at yoga by believing in it. Mm-hmm. You have to do it. Mm-hmm. You have to practice it, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Mm-hmm. And cultivating awareness is a practice. And it's a continuously refocusing yourself to be aware of where you are, what you're doing, what's going on. And so you can get better at it by practicing it. And it's not it's like a weekend class might inspire you, but then you have to practice it on a regular basis for it to become the way you operate.
I have a lot of patients that say things like, I've tried meditation before, or I've tried deep breathing before as a form of being mindful. And I know you say you don't really try and push them or lead them, but have you found some things that have been more successful? Let's say they've said to you something along those lines, like, I'm sure you've heard that before. I've tried meditation before, or I've tried this before. But maybe you got a sense that they were somewhat interested. What would you say to that person if they're open to the idea?
Yeah, I kind of try to jump on those cues, and I try to match it to them. So I try to get to know them, right? And then I try to help them use things that are going to work for them. So there's a lot of ways to cultivate those things. And if they're an outdoor person going for walks, you know, walking meditation, or because I think a lot of people that say that sort of thing, they don't really have much experience. And it's like I said about believing in yoga, it's the same with, say, a religious group. You know, if do you believe in this, do you believe in that? It's not about believing; it's about experiencing. You know, what is it like to experience something and really feel it, think it, be in it. That's what I go for people that like. And so part of what I do when I'm treating people is I'm focused and I'm showing them awareness. I'm showing them that I'm paying attention, you know, to them the whole time. I'm not distracted. I'm really, I guess, modeling. Just like a parent, you know, trying to model for their kids. You can tell your kids what you want them to do, but that doesn't do any good. You know, you can, the best you can do is do the best you can to be the best person you can, and hope they notice. And so I guess that's the task I give myself, is to model it and then to encourage people to follow the way that, and, you know, give them permission, you know, that you don't have to do it a certain way, you know, what's going to work for you. But the goal is to experience it. And then once you do, and you practice it, you get better at it.
Absolutely. That's really great. I can say personally, I've experienced that, because anyone listening, I've seen Dr. Grimshaw as a patient, and it's such a different energy when you come into the room, because you can feel, and I've seen the complete opposite too with providers, that, you know, they're so focused on, and it's just unfortunately the reality that they have to check so many boxes in an electronic medical record somewhere, that they're so distracted. So I think that they're missing a lot of cues and things. When we had talked about doing this podcast, we talked about, do we want to do this in person or do we want to do this online? And despite the mask situation here, you had said very much that you like to be able to see people's eyes. And I feel the same way too. I feel like it tells you so much. You know, whether it's, I don't know, I've heard gateway to the soul. I don't know. There must be something in yoga that talks about that as well.
Right. Well, and, you know, my teacher, looking into his eyes is like you're looking into the ocean. You know, he's a really advanced human being, and someone I emulate. And so, yeah, there you see a lot in people who have delved, you know.
Yeah, I have to imagine it's had an immense. Your yoga practice has had an immense impact on the way that you practice medicine as well.
Yes.
I mean, because that's cultivated awareness. I imagine it's even hard to believe if you hadn't had that pathway, would you be practicing the same way?
I'm sure not.
Yeah.
Because it kind of led me. I started really getting regularly practicing yoga around the time when I was leaving the university. And I it's like discovering a whole new world, like realizing feeling things within my body that I could recognize it more in other people's bodies, and I could like invent on the spot a way to treat something or a way to show somebody an exercise, because I knew what it felt like inside me. And so it opened up a whole new way for me to share my own experience of understanding my body, my thoughts, my feelings, and help other people do that. So it changed the way I do things, and it continues to do that.
Yeah. In your experience, what are some of the most common stressors created by external societal expectations, and how do those impact the their belief systems or actions that someone might take, such as like, I'm a bad parent or husband, and they may end up isolating more. I believe one of the things you mentioned in your talk was vulnerability and connecting more with people that can help with this.
Yeah. Right. But vulnerability is really, being willing to be vulnerable is brave. And I think there's a lot of fear. Fear is a big factor today. And what's behind anger, shame, what's behind also isolating and not connecting, it is fear. And the fear can be that they feel like they don't want to or can't, it's not safe to be vulnerable or to be authentically themselves, right? I have to be this for my spouse. I have to be this way for my boss. For my company, I have to act like this. This is the procedure I have to follow to sell widgets or whatever the company does. And so people are outside of themselves a lot in society, because that our society is very materialistic. And I think that's one of the core issues, is that money is driving the system. And that makes all of us feel devalued. Like in so many different, just take different examples of like unions and the unions going on strike, or the different examples of what's happening right now, and the kind of way we're polarized. It has to do with people, I think, feeling like they're not of value. They're not being valued by the system, and the system isn't running based on the valuing people as important community resource. That the resource is money and making money. So I think that's one of the big driving factors, is the materialistic society that is really driving a lot of the other patterns.
What can someone do? I know it's a difficult balance, but because obviously there are actual things that need to be met. You have to have a roof over your head and that kind of thing. But once you get past that point, how can people find maybe not a balance point, but a point where they don't succumb to that so deeply that guides all their decisions?
Yeah. Well, to value ourselves and to value and connect with each other is the starting point. Asking, this is really deep question.
You seem like the man to answer it, though.
I think we treat each other with respect. We value each other and do authentic work for the money we make. You know, that's my advice to people, is try to have a job that you feel like makes a difference in the world and is, worthy of your time. And if you don't feel like you're being valued at all, and you're in a kind of work that is not serving you or the world, change your vocation. I like Parker Palmer defines vocation as your deepest love meeting the needs of the world. What do you love to do that meets needs in the world? Do that. Be brave enough to actually feel you're worthy of having a vocation. Not just a yes person to whatever's going to put money in your pocket and food on the table. And that sounds really idealistic, but it's really foundational, I think, to a society that has half a chance at living peacefully and in harmony, with each other, not destroying the earth.
Yeah.
And each other in the process.
Yeah. Along those lines, when something happens that maybe rubs you the wrong way. How do you recommend someone listening to this can use that as a learning opportunity or a chance to further connect instead of being quick to anger?
Oh, that's great. So that's that space between your perception of what's happening and how you're going to react to it. And that's really important. That's a key tool to learn, because so often we assume why we think that person's doing something to us. They're not doing something to us, really. Who knows what they're thinking? Who knows where they've been, what happened to them that day, where they're coming from. So to make any assumption when someone says something to you that feels hurtful is, you got a really good chance of being wrong. And so to recognize that you're perceiving, say, anger or insult, to recognize that may or may not be what's happening. But rather than reacting immediately, if you develop the practice of not immediately reacting, of taking just that split second, that moment of checking in with yourself, not judging, learning how to not judge, and to take whatever is happening in front of you as it is what it is. It's not good or bad. It's not right or wrong. You don't have to judge it. Just be in that moment, and then when you respond, you don't have to feed the flames of the fire that might be getting started. And it's a really hard thing to do. Yeah. But it's a key skill.
Yeah. I find I've struggled with that a lot. I personally, I've made a rule of not responding to an email in particular, because I try and do exactly what you're saying, but I don't know if I'm sometimes emotionally mature emaugh to be able in that moment. So I try and create even more space than if it's possible.
Yeah, right. Emails or texts where you're not getting the nonverbal, you're not getting the emotional, right, the tone of it at all. So, yeah. That's
particularly challenging with texts and emails.
Right.
I think it compounds what you're saying even further.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If you also talked about alternative ways to communicate and connect instead of running away from a problem in that speech, and I believe you were talking about asking questions, but I wasn't sure exactly. Oh, yeah. That was one thing I was hoping maybe you could expand upon a little bit, because you said, instead of running away or going to fear, ask questions. Do you have any examples of what those might be?
Yeah, well, rather than reacting, try to be curious.
Mm-hmm.
And rather than coming back with a retort, you can ask a question. And so you can say, like, I don't really understand, or what's going on here? What's just happened? Like with kids, for instance, when they do something, you're like, okay, what just happened here? That's a good way to treat kids that are coming from difficult and trauma and environments that are not very safe. And so because it may appear that they're being aggressive towards another kid, but they may be just reacting, and they might feel afraid, and they're just trying to protect themselves or defend themselves. So instead of saying, why did you do that? They may not even know why they did that.
Mm.
They're just reacting, in a way that they've seen in their environment. So to help change that way of communicating, like call it nonviolent communication, you're asking what's going on, and there may be a blank stare coming back at you, because they may not even realize they're in this loop, or they're on a rage. But it helps you change the potential course of that interaction. So Brene Brown talks about that, getting curious, and then asking more to try to understand better what's going on, rather than just starting to participate in a duel.
Yeah, absolutely. How has the pandemic changed the way you view healthcare, and more particularly the patients you see coping with stressors? Or maybe it hasn't.
You know, I haven't, not a lot. I feel like I'm just doing a lot more work helping people get through and find ways to cope. So I have seen a lot of more like physical discomfort, pain, stiffness, loss of function, because people kind of froze. And when the pandemic started, they got isolated, they maybe stopped moving, stopped exercising, started eating differently, maybe drinking more alcohol. And apparently that's been a big thing during the pandemic, a lot more purchase of alcohol. And so just helping people like see where they are, what's driving it, and helping them walk their way back out. But the question you said, how has it changed? It's kind of maybe changed the nature of the kinds of things I'm working on with people. Particularly
with people that you see.
Yeah. But it's sort of different themes now, and because it's almost everybody these days that the emotional stress and the psychological stress is, most of my patients are pretty aware that that's impacting them physically, and see the connection. And so that we work on that.
What have you experienced in the past that, because I think this is really relevant now too, someone, maybe they have been isolating a lot over these last 2 years, and they just feel so much inertia from doing that for so long, and they know they need to get help with something. Like maybe they know they're feeling depressed or anxious. Do you have any ideas on how someone to help them motivate to take the first step to go see someone? Because I feel like more than ever, people are waiting longer and longer to get help.
Well, sometimes I share my own experience. I'll try to put them at ease. Like if they're not really comfortable with the idea of maybe going to counseling. I've gone to counseling ever since I was about 18 years old, on and off, different periods of my life. And I keep going back as I need to, because it helps me cope and deal with my life. So sometimes I just share about myself. Like, when I was in a situation like this, I went to a counselor and it really helped. And I might give an example or two that is just from my own life. So I'm not really afraid to share a bit about myself, and it's a way of, modeling vulnerability. Since it's been a big help in my life, I just sometimes will share that.
Yeah, modeling vulnerability, that's really good. So wrapping up, how if someone likes some of the stuff that they heard tonight, when in our interview here, how can someone find out more about you and your practice?
Well, my website is oldtowndoc.com, and that's the easiest way to get the information, of contact information, and learn more about the way the practice works. And I have blogs in there about ideas and things that come to me. So that's a good way to learn more about me, and through email or call in the office. Perfect.
Thank you very much for being with us tonight and sharing your knowledge, your expertise, and your wisdom.
Well, thanks, Chris. Well, thanks for the opportunity. I really value you and your practice as well.
Oh, thank you. So this has been the Rehabilitation Collaborative with Dr. David Grimshaw. Be sure to check out future episodes. We're going to post on every Thursday, the first and third Thursday at anchor.fm/rehabcollab. That's REHABCOLLAB. Or you can also find future episodes on Spotify. Thanks so much for listening today. And before you go, be sure to follow our podcast so you never miss out on another episode again at anchor.fm/rehabcollab. You can also find us on Spotify. We currently post on the first and third Thursday of each month, so be sure to check back then. If you'd like to learn more about what the Rehabilitation Collaborative is up to, you can also find us on facebook.com/rehabcollab.